Your job is to lead young Marines. And some of those young Marines are Marine officers. So I'd like to tell you two stories that both come from my first year in the fleet. One is a story that's about trust. And the other is a story that's about love. Sergeant Adam Bonatai was a squad leader in my first platoon. He had 3 years in the Corps. He deployed once with a MU that had participated in the Iraq invasion. When he returned, a 2nd Marine Division board had meritoriously promoted him to sergeant. He was widely recognized as one of the best, if not the best, NCOs in our company. The lieutenant that I replaced told me repeatedly how lucky I was to have him. Bonatai was good, and he knew he was good. When I first met him, I also noticed how he called my predecessor Sir, and how he called me Lieutenant. I doubt I need to explain to a room full of salty staff NCOs what that was about. But I thought to myself, whatever. We had work to do. I checked into the unit in April, and we were leaving for Iraq in June. Marines in our sister battalions were already dying in places like Ramadi and Fallujah. When we weren't training, I had assigned the platoon a book to read, the science fiction classic and meditation on citizenship and soldiering, Starship Troopers. And we would discuss a chapter a week. They hated this. Sir, if we wanted to read books, we would have gone to college instead of joining the Corps. Again, I thought to myself, whatever. A couple of weeks before deploying, we were in garrison. I had briefed the platoon. The next day, we practiced squad patrolling techniques around the battalion area. I told the squad leaders to show up that morning with an overlay of their patrol route and a copy of their 5-paragraph order. When the 3 squad leaders came into the company office, the 2nd and 3rd squad leaders, both corporals, handed me their overlays and orders. When I asked Sergeant Bonatai for his, he said, "Yeah, I didn't do it, Lieutenant." To which I responded, "What do you mean you didn't do it?" He then said, "I don't think that's good training, so my squad, we're going to do something else." I asked him to meet me in 20 minutes in the duty hut along with my platoon sergeant where we could speak in private. So when Bonatai entered the duty hut, I presented him with a counseling sheet. The sheet was little more than a Microsoft Word document that I had quickly drafted. It broke down his proficiency in several categories, from physical fitness to tactical competence, all evaluated on a scale from 1 to 10, in which I marked him outstanding across all disciplines except for 1. When it came to leadership, I marked him at the opposite end of the scale, as woefully deficient. I explained to him that leadership requires loyalty both down and up the chain of command. That by refusing to execute the training we'd all discussed, he'd shown me a startling lack of loyalty, and this explained his deficient mark in leadership. When I added that I'd be putting this counseling sheet in his SRB, he interrupted me. "What the hell do you know about leading Marines, Lieutenant? I was leading Marines when you were still in college." Told him that might be the case, but that he still needed to sign the counseling sheet, which he did. 2 weeks later, we left for Iraq. Units have centers of gravity. Just because you're the platoon commander or the platoon sergeant, it doesn't mean you are necessarily the only center of gravity in your platoon. Sergeant Bonatai was one center of gravity within our platoon, and leading the platoon with him out of alignment was like trying to ride a bicycle holding a bowling ball in one hand. After a month in country, our platoon had been in a couple of firefights and we hit some IEDs. We performed well enough, but we knew tougher days were ahead. And I didn't know how to align our platoon given the underlying tension that existed between me and Bonaparte. As we began our second month in country, our platoon participated in a battalion sweep along the banks of the Euphrates, near Haditha, a particularly violent corner of the war at that point. Now, it was July, well over 100 degrees. We'd been on a dismounted patrol for hours, low on water, sweating into our boots, as we finally entered downtown Haditha in a platoon column on a road that ran along the river. I was in the center of the platoon with Bonaparte's squad when I got a call from up front. The lead squad was at an intersection and didn't know which way to turn. As I jogged up the column, I passed Bonaparte's point man, Pete Bagarella, a string bean of a lance corporal from outside of Boston. My radio operator was struggling to keep up, and Bagarella made a joke at his expense as we jogged by. I could still hear Bagarella laughing behind us when the IED clapped off. Incoming small arms fire came from the far side of the riverbank. I called troops in contact over the company TAC. We were in the middle of an IED-initiated ambush. When I looked behind me, Bagarella was lying in the middle of the road, his day pack, rifle, and other bits of gear strewn in a yard sale around him. He lost most of his left leg from the knee down, and it was lying there with his gear. Frag also peppered his eyes, and he was shouting that he couldn't see. We had to drag him to cover so Doc could work on him. We also had to start running his medevac, which involved us linking up with the rest of the company. I was on the radio with my company commander coordinating all of this when Bonaparte ran over to check in. The volume of incoming fire was increasing and had us pinned down. We needed to gain and maintain fire superiority. He then asked some questions about moving one of his teams. I cut him off and I said, "Just fight your squad." And then I got back on the radio. Before long, Bonaparte and his squad had laid down an effective base of fire. This took care of the threat from the far bank and cleared the way for Bagarella's medevac. And late in the afternoon, we finished our patrol and we withdrew from the city. After that day, the dynamic in our platoon changed. Orders were now received with a general sense of buy-in. Missions went smoother. The center of gravity had shifted, and we had come into alignment. What accounted for this change? 20 years have passed since that ambush. Sergeant Bonatai is now my good friend Adam. He's an ER nurse and firefighter in Allentown, PA. And when we talk about those days, it's always with a laugh as he remembers, to use his words, what a hard time he gave me. But when I asked him once explicitly why all that stopped after the ambush in Haditha, he seemed surprised by my question, as if it should have been obvious. The shift was completely clear in his mind. "You proved your trust in me," he said. "You told me to fight my squad. It's hard not to trust someone who trusts you." The best units, they run on trust. I learned that if you place trust in your Marines, even your hard cases might surprise you. The best units also run on love, which is what I'd like to discuss next. So, all through that summer of 2004, while our rifle platoon waged counterinsurgency in Haditha, hit, and other unbarring backwaters, one thing I remember is that it never rained, not once. Within our platoon, we had a betting pool. $10 got you in. Try your luck and pick the first day of rain. And when the dust finally turned to mud on November 8th, all 46 of us were staged just outside Fallujah, in the assembly area, hunkered down in slit trenches, waiting for the assault to begin. I don't remember anybody collecting on the pool. All it takes is the sight of someone sprinting across a wet crosswalk, and I'm back in Fallujah, and back to one street in particular, Highway 10. Veterans of the battle each have their story of crossing Highway 10's expansive 4 lanes, covered by machine gun fire, with insurgents dug into the buildings on the far side, defending this, their main line of resistance. The story of Gunnery Sergeant Ryan Shane, a platoon sergeant in our battalion, has always remained close. On the second day of the battle, Gunny Shane's rifle platoon was perched on a rooftop covering another platoon that rushed the gauntlet of crossing Highway 10. Within minutes, a slug ripped through the leg of Sergeant Lonnie Wells, a 29-year-old career Marine and father of 4. He was stranded in the open. He lay face down, blood pooling around his waist, moving only a little. Without hesitation, Ryan went for Lonnie, leaving his rifle behind so it wouldn't slow him down. A combat cameraman captured the scene in 4 photos. In the first, Ryan stands in the wet street. He's bent over Lonnie. His 220-pound frame tugs the drag strap on Lonnie's body armor. In the second, another Marine runs to Ryan's side, trying to help. Clumsily, the second Marine bends over Lonnie while Ryan keeps pulling. The next frame is taken just as a bullet tears into Ryan's lower back, scrambling his stomach. He's on his heels, falling. The other Marine watches in a half sprint, heading for cover. The final frame is Ryan and Lonnie, both laying face down on the street in the rain. Lonnie is dead, and Ryan will survive. So nearly 2 years later, 50 of us gathered in an auditorium, much like this one, in Camp Lejeune. Ryan Shane would be decorated for his actions. Since Lonnie died, Ryan's 220 pounds had withered to 150. After countless surgeries, he'd been medically discharged from the Corps. The toll his stomach wound had taken on his body could be seen in his atrophied frame, but it was the forced separation from the Corps that he loved that left the deeper wound. You could see that in his eyes. I sat in my camis a few rows back. We came to attention as the adjutant read the citation for Ryan's Bronze Star. Our commanding general pinned it on his chest and then ceded the floor to Ryan. He thanked all of us for coming to the ceremony. He thanked his family for their care during his slow, ongoing recovery. And then his voice thickened, and he held his stare upward into the glare of the auditorium lights, as if speaking to a place outside of that room. I'm finding it really hard, he said, to accept that my greatest achievement as a Marine, this medal, also comes from my greatest failure. I didn't save Lonnie that day. Dangling from Ryan's shirt pocket was his Bronze Star pinned with a small brass V, which, as you know, denotes valor, the conquest of fear. The fear Ryan must have felt as he ran onto Highway 10 is a sensation I am familiar with. That clench of the chest, the sluggishness of the limbs, the slowing of time, and the premonition of a violent death that lurks behind each shut door you must shoulder open or alley you must sprint across. I know the way it makes my mouth dry. I know the way it can stalk you. I can describe to you how fear feels, but not courage. Courage is not an emotion. It's a virtue. You don't feel brave. Then what did Ryan feel? What force overpowered his fear as he went after Lonnie, compelling him to stand against the thick snaps of machine gun fire while he dragged his friend towards safety, until one of those snaps found its mark in his stomach? So Ronnie and Lonnie both served in Bravo Company, a close-knit group. Ryan was tough and big-hearted, a great mentor to the NCOs in Bravo, the corporals and sergeants who, like Lonnie, were coming up through the ranks. He and Lonnie had trained for the better part of a year together and endured months of a grinding counterinsurgency before the Fallujah battle. It's safe to say that Ryan saw a younger version of himself in Lonnie. Ryan, as a senior enlisted Marine, was also a key leader in Bravo, and as such, he felt responsibility for Lonnie. He felt love for him. That love is the opposite of fear. It's why Ryan ran out to save Lonnie. Yet Ryan's feeling of failure reveals a painful paradox of combat. As he and Lonnie lay bleeding in the center of Highway 10, our entire battalion, including our regiment and division, thousands of Marines, had phase lines our commanders had ordered us to reach. These phase lines, points of advance deeper inside Fallujah, indicated on the maps we carried, marked our mission for that day. We had to reach them or fail in that mission. From the general commanding our division to the corporal commanding the junior enlisted in his team, the mission came first, before the Marines. This is the nature of war. If our lives took precedence, no hill would ever be taken, no building stormed or city seized, because some of us would die achieving the mission. The courage shown by Lonnie, by Ryan, by countless others is essential to that success. It is a courage bred from love, from months spent training together, knowing each other's families, suffering shoulder to shoulder, and gathering, as we do today, to honor the memory of Marine heroes like Sergeant Walter Singleton. These bonds, fully realized, inspire incredible sacrifice in service of one another and in service of the mission. Therein lies the paradox. The mission still comes first. The price may be a hefty one. Your friends, your Marines. The profession of arms may call on you to destroy what you love. This is the heartbreak that I could hear in Ryan's voice. Your heart can't break if you weren't in love. A lot of people have asked me about that day, continued Ryan, but nobody has ever asked who came to get me. After I was shot, there were two of us lying out there along Highway 10. And his eyes fixed toward the back of the crowd on two lance corporals who had received no recognition except for this nod from Ryan, an acknowledgement of how they felt about each other. One by one that day, we left our seats to shake Ryan's hands. Many of us went on to more deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in valleys, hamlets, and cities too countless to number, Ryan Shane's words held true. Our greatest achievements are often tied to our greatest failures. It's a paradox as old as war. So remember, as you return to the fleet, if you trust your Marines, they will place their trust in you. And if you love each other, you will find reservoirs of courage. Thank you.
The moral, right? The morale and the troops and the cohesion that a team makes that can actually overcome great odds, right? And you talk about that in your first story with building that team, a team that's bound by love, right? And you express that in the second story as well. And for those of you that see the pamphlets that you might have already, and you maybe read the citation about Walter Singleton, he does something very similarly to get his Medal of Honor, right? He runs into gunfire and he goes in there to pull out his Marines. And if you read a little bit more, if you do a little bit more research, he's not an O3, right? He's support personnel that's with them, right? And so it doesn't matter what your MOS background is, that is something that could be called upon you to do, and that is the nature of our profession. And I think certainly the front four rows here, these sergeants that are attending sergeant school right now, that message that you said at the very end, talking about the dichotomy between the mission and the Marines, right? Mission first, Marines always, right? Something that we say in the Marine Corps. I think they'll probably feel it a little bit more and it'll resonate with them because they had just recently gone through a decision enforcement case study in which they were placed in the shoes of a captain that had to make very difficult decisions inside of Korea. And it was very difficult for some of them. You could see it. They were battling with the, I want to take care of my Marines, but I have a mission, right? So I'd like to transition us into the second part of this this event. And really what this next part is going to be is we're just going to have a discussion. I will lead off the discussion and I'll kind of get the gear spinning in all of us. And then I'd like to turn it over to the audience and anybody that might have questions for Elliot to please chime in. We have a microphone over there and we have a microphone over there in the aisleway. So please, if you at any point have a question that comes to your mind, just make your way over to one of those microphones. And when we transition after the second question that I ask them, we will field as many questions as we can in the time frame that we have. So the other caveat I'll give to this is that the questions I'm going to ask, just to lead off this discussion, they're going to have a little bit of context surrounding them so that whether you're familiar with Elliot's writing or his work or anything like that, you should be able to participate and understand what we're talking about in this discussion regardless. So I'll start out, sir, and basically I'll give an anecdote from my own life about how I basically came to be introduced to some of your work, right? So in 2016, I was a sergeant and I was on duty, and my officer of the day sitting next to me was reading a book called Ghost Fleet, and some of you might be familiar with Ghost Fleet. It's on the Commandant's reading list, and so we started to talk about this book, Ghost Fleet, and he highly recommended it to me. And so I quickly went out and I purchased it the next day after I got off duty, and I ended up reading the whole thing in like the first week. I just finished this book. And about a week after that, I was in my battalion executive officer's office, and I was fixing her computer, and I saw the same book, Ghost Fleet, sitting on her desk. And so I engaged her in a conversation about it and asked her how she liked it and whatnot. And she quickly told me that the commanding general, the 1st Marine Logistics Group, had basically tasked every unit subordinate to him to stand up an officer's book club and to start to read this book, Ghost Fleet. And I bring that up because what was interesting to me is that this is a book about, it's fiction. It's a book about a future military operation 10, 15, 20 years in the future, basically where China and Russia team up to preemptively strike against America. And it's all fiction, right? And so what was interesting to me is that immediately made its way to the Commandant's reading list as well. And so with that, sir, you were already, after your career in the Marine Corps and you started to write, you published a lot of books before you ever got to 2034, which is a book that we're going to kind of discuss and that I've introduced some of you all to out in the audience. That was one of your later books, right? And you've recently released 2054, which actually just released a couple months ago, and now you and Admiral Scrivides are now writing 2084, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
So that's going to be the third book in this series, right? And these are all books about the future, right? The years are the timestamps. You're already an established writer. So what was it about this subgenre of fiction, this future-focused military fiction, that was so intriguing to you that you were, in essence, willing to kind of stake your career on it because you're devoting time, effort, energy, periods of your life to writing these books. So what was so interesting about this subgenre of future-based military fiction that was so intriguing to you to get into it? And then secondly, what is it that you think that military practitioners such as these in this room are able to get out of reading this kind of fiction genre?
Sure. In my remarks, as I alluded to, I forced my entire 1st platoon to read Starship Troopers, and they still tease me about it. So I think I've always felt that it's important as a war fighter to, you got to work out and stay physically fit, but you also have to stay, mentally acute. And my time in the Marine Corps was spent thinking a lot about my adversaries. Who are these people I'm going up against? Who are we fighting against in Iraq and Afghanistan? And in the early days of those wars, that was actually a big question. People didn't understand the difference between Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Mahdi army that al-Sadr had. So nobody understood this. So we were playing catch up. So I think as a Marine, it's incumbent on us to spend a good chunk of our time trying to understand the mindset of our adversaries. You need to agree with them. You need to understand where they're coming from. You'll be much more effective at your job if you do. So I had always had that inclination, and then transitioned out to become a writer, which by definition, when you're writing fiction, you're writing books where you are trying to inhabit the minds of other people and understand these made-up people. So that came very naturally to me. And then the way 2034 came about is Admiral Scrivides and I actually knew each other's in a separate context. We both graduated from the same school, and he went on to be the dean of that school, so that's sort of how I got to know him. And by coincidence, we had a shared book editor. And so our shared book editor is actually the one who said, hey, Elliot, I work with this author. He's this admiral guy. Maybe you've heard of him. I'm like, oh, yeah, we're friends. And he said, well, his idea is to try to write a book that imagines what it would look like if the U.S. and China went to war in the year 2034. He hasn't written novels, and I think you guys could pair up and do a good job. And so that sort of led us down this pathway of imagining out this trilogy of books, where 2034 is about war with China, 2054 is about domestic conflict in the U.S., and so it's about AI, and the last will be about a war that deals with the environment. So, but the spirit behind all of these books is to imagine these events. So hopefully we can take the types of actions as a nation so they never occur, or if they do occur, so that we are prepared. And it's, and this is also my experience as a Marine. Like, I went through, before I ever was in a firefight, I had gone through years of training. I was telling you, Denny, like, OCS is just down the road. I've got a lot of very traumatic memories there. I'd spent a lot of time, and I can tell you, the first firefight was nothing like any of the training. It wasn't like fire team rushes, I'm up. It's not what it was like. It was different, but because I'd done all the training, I was flexible enough in the environment. The Marines I worked with, we were all flexible enough to immediately adapt. And I think if you're intellectually stimulating yourself, if you're thinking about these issues continuously, and you're reading your classics, you're reading novels, whatever you come up against, you're going to have a context to deal with the actual problem. And I think that's why it's really important to read widely.
Yeah, and I would certainly agree. I've definitely advocated for people to read works of fiction, especially around the military context, because sometimes we get wrapped up in the history, and that is great, and there's a lot of lessons to learn, because we can see people have actually lived through these experiences. We can pinpoint, hey, this is the decisions they made, this is what led them through. But in the fiction, it does spark imagination, right? And this subgenre of military fiction kind of future focuses, it's really nothing new, right? And for some of the audience members, you might be familiar with Tom Clancy and some of Tom Clancy's original works, right? We have, I think it's Red Storm Rising in the mid-1980s, where Tom Clancy's kind of fleshing out what does a war look like between the Soviet Union, the USSR, and America at that time, really right before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And same kind of thing with Ghost Fleet, 2034, 2454, like you said, is more about tensions within the United States, but still there's something to extract from that as well. And with regards to that, you said imagination, right? You said that a couple times in there, and that's really the big picture that I give people is, and this really applies to PME specifically, but I think it more broadly applies to leadership in a military organization regardless, right? If you're a leader, your job, in essence, is to spark imaginative, creative thinking within your Marines, the people that you lead, because ultimately that is what we need moving forward, right? And so with regards to that, a lot of people in this room will be familiar with something called maneuver warfare theory, right? Maneuver warfare theory is the warfighting philosophy of the Marine Corps, and it has been since the 1980s, right? 1989, FMFM1 is released. In 1996, it's revised to become MCDP1. And in that, General Gray, the 29th Commandant of the Marine Corps, he states that maneuver warfare theory will be the warfighting philosophy of the Marine Corps, right? And maneuver warfare is really just this umbrella term, and under maneuver warfare, there's a lot of different tenets, right? And these tenets kind of feed in and they make up what maneuver warfare is. I want to pick on one of those tenets for this next question. And that is the tenet of surfaces and gaps. And you can think about surfaces and gaps like strong points and weak points, or armor, chinks in the armor, centers of gravity, and critical vulnerabilities, right? And this can be physical things. It can be how you position your troops and where you have the faults in your lines. It can be spatial, temporal, it can be all kinds of different things, right? But in writing a book like 2034, 2054, 2084, you're looking at things that either are in existence right now, or maybe like technologies that are in their infancy right now, and you're extrapolating out into the future. What could this possibly look like, and how could this fundamentally change how we're going to interact with warfare, with geopolitics, things like that? In the Marine Corps specifically, we like to look at war from two lenses, really, right? We have the nature of war, and that is going to be everything that is ever present in warfare all the way back through time. It doesn't matter if you're marching with Alexander the Great, or if you're going into the Helmand province of Afghanistan. the nature of war is friction, fluidity, uncertainty, complexity, the human element, the human dimension, right? Those things are constant throughout time. Everybody faces them. The character of war, the other lens in which we look at warfare in the Marine Corps, is everything that is constantly changing, right? It is the technology, it's the weaponry, and it's how these tactics and equipment, how they fundamentally change the way that we will fight a war, right? You look at an example of countries that have not been imaginative and that haven't identified these changes happening, and they suffer greatly, right? You can look at China in the 1800s, a land empire that wasn't imaginative enough to think about why they might need a robust navy, and they suffer greatly for that. Probably a more poignant example that might resonate with more people. Post-World War I, pre-World War II, we're in the 1930s, and we can see the writings on the wall that Germany is going to be coming back, and they're going to be a real threat. And countries like France that share a border with Germany, they can truly see this, right? So what does France do? They build the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line is the most intricate trench and bunker system ever comprised by man. And what does that get France? It gets them 6 weeks when Germany invades, because France was preparing for the First World War, that trench warfare, right, static warfare kind of thing. Germany had adapted, they had instituted this thing called blitzkrieg, right, a different way of fighting. They had bypassed all of that. So really, when you're trying to imagine this new world and you're writing about this, what is it that maybe you've learned about in this process that has really come to your mind, and you look at it and you're like, hey, that's a surface or a gap, right? That's something that's fundamentally possibly going to change how warfare or geopolitics plays out in the future. And as military practitioners, people invested in this, you should probably pay due attention, and you neglect to do so at your own peril.
I think, for those of you who are going out, back to the fleet as NCOs, I think one of the things that is important is to understand too, and to be able to explain the context in which they're serving, what they're being asked to do. And I think there's something really important and profound that's going on in the Marine Corps right now when I watch it from outside, which is, the Marine Corps is being called upon to really, we all know that saying, the Marines are the most ready when the nation is the least. We are being called right now to be ready in certain areas where it's very clear that the nation is the least. And what I mean by that is the Marine Corps is being asked to innovate right now at a pace that the other services are not quite innovating, and to take some risks, to take institutional risks with things like Force Design 2030 and all the changes that I'm sure you all are seeing in your units. The Marine Corps is I've been out that one 10 years or so, but it's a vastly different organization than it was when I was in. And you're looking at it, and so when we talk about reading and our intellectual development, you mentioned Al Gray in the 1980s and maneuver warfare. So we all know the doctrinal tenet, the holy grail of the Marine Corps is MCDP-1 warfighting, right? Does anybody know why it's warfighting, all one word? It's not MCDP-1 war space fighting, it's MCDP-1, all one word, warfighting. Because it's a verb? No. It's a nod to the Germans. So if you actually look at the ideas of maneuver warfare, mission tactics, commander's intent, that was a style of warfare that the Germans pioneered really after the First World War that led to the Blitzkrieg in the Second World War. The Maginot Line was actually it was an innovation that came during the stormtroop raids that the Germans did at the very end of the First World War, where they figured out if we had these heavily armed stormtrooper units, so heavily armed and armored, they could puncture the trenches of the First World War, create a gap, and then flood troops in through the gap. And they did that in 1918 when the Marines were fighting the spring offensive in Belleau Wood. They were up against German stormtroopers, and they were trying to hold back these attacks. The problems the Germans had in 1918 was they would launch these suicidal attacks and grenades, bombs, and they'd make the puncture, and then all these other Germans try to go through the gap. They couldn't really get anywhere. They were all foot mobile, okay, we're going to march 4 miles, and then we're all smoked, and we don't have any food, and the war's over. So, but that idea started in the First World War. By the Second World War, what do you have? You can create the gap, and now you got a tank. You punch the gap, and they would rush these panzer divisions through the gap. But the problem that you would have is it's very, very tough to communicate back then. You know, you go 30 miles inland, you don't have a radio, so you needed commanders who could use the initiative, commander's intent, mission tactics, a lot of pushing responsibility down to subordinate units. And so I only bring this up because it's actually important to understand where what we're doing fits into a larger intellectual framework. As for instance, if you look at the Second World War, the Soviets did not adopt that framework. The Soviets had, and they still have, a very, very top-down philosophy of warfighting. In the Second World War, there were two variants of the original Soviet tanks. There was a command variant that had a radio that could receive and transmit. The other variants literally had a radio that only received. So they didn't want to hear what the lower tanker guy, and they suffered for it greatly. So they're like, all right, Elliot, well, like that's like all ancient history. It's not. Look at what just happened in Ukraine. I work as a journalist and spent quite a bit of time in Ukraine since. If you look at what happened to the Russian army in the early days of that war, it was the same thing. It was that top-down approach. It's why you had more Russian colonels and generals killed in this war than any other war. It's because they had to go forward to the line because nobody's allowed to make a decision except for the colonel or the general. So these guys go all the way forward to move units around. That is a direct reflection of their warfighting philosophy. That would never happen as Marines. Because NCOs and staff NCOs would just be making the decisions. And they'd be making the decisions because they understand commander's intent. They understand mission tactics, where you guys know a mission statement, right? It's always the same way. First squad will attack to destroy in order to. And that's the statement. That in order to is your mission statement. That in order to statement in the 5-paragraph order, because you can trace that all the way back to the trenches of the Western Front. And you guys are going to have to figure out how to project that all the way forward. So the reason warfighting is all one word is because when not any of the ideology, just like the Germans were pretty good fighters. They did a good job of fighting. So a lot of those ideas we took and we basically appropriated them as Marines. And they become fundamental to us. But you guys are at the intersection of, higher level decision makers. And then, making sure the young Marines are going to be motivated to do what they got to do, particularly, when it comes down to actual combat. And so I think that's why it's critically important to have a mind that is studying these things and understands these things, and then can understand when the situation changes how to adapt. And we're at a moment right now of rapid adaptation. Rapid change in how the U.S. military is set up. I'm happy to talk about that too.
Yeah, we're obviously seeing a lot of these things taking place live time, and we're just experimenting to see how they're going to flesh out. Things like artificial intelligence, 4 years ago, if we were having this discussion, probably wouldn't even come up, right? But now it's a very real thing. We're trying to figure that out. At this time, if there's anybody in the audience that would like to ask a question, I'd ask that you just make your way down to the microphones. And feel free to ask a question.
It's not necessarily probably a realistic vision of victory, but is less than that something that can be sold to many of the Ukrainian people. And you're seeing the same thing in Israel right now too. What's the definition of victory? The destruction of all of Hamas, and is that victory? And I think in my own experience, Iraq and Afghanistan, what was victory? And it was never clearly articulated. So if at the political level, there's no clear vision of what victory is going to be, it makes it very, very difficult to enact that vision. And I think when we talk about the role of imagination and how key it is, it's the ability of a nation to see what's going on and to see how the world is moving, and then to have the national will to shift accordingly. So again, I'm just going to use another Ukraine example and the Marine Corps example. We're sitting here. The Marine Corps has in recent years really debated FD 2030. It's divesting itself from many long-term platforms, from armor to artillery to dagger to my own heart, snipers. But it's doing that in service of a vision that hasn't occurred yet. If we look at Ukraine, I don't know how many of you are aware of this. 1/2 of Russia's Black Sea fleet has either been sunk or so heavily damaged it's had to go into dry dock. That is against Ukraine, a nation that basically has no navy. So a nation with a significant navy has basically lost half of its fleet to a nation with no navy. We are a nation, we think about fighting in the Pacific, that is heavily invested in large platforms, $1 billion aircraft carriers. And we're seeing in Ukraine right now that, you know, that surface missiles, drones can sink very heavy platforms. So as Marines, we're kind of being called upon to imagine what a war would look like if a Ford-class aircraft carrier is no longer the coin of the realm. And in the Second World War, that occurred. Before the Second World War, the coin of the realm in naval combat was the battleship. And then, you know, we suddenly all realized, no, it's actually the aircraft carrier. We had to make that twist very quickly. I would imagine we're going to have to make similar mental leaps. And our legacy as Marines is that is what we've always done. That is why, you know, when we say we're the most ready when the nation is the least, I mean, yes, that means like our rifles are clean and, you know, our pack is ready to go. But it really means we've done the intellectual work. And to come back to like the Pacific, you know, the other thing we do as Marines that we're great at is we're great at telling our story. And the stories, when people say the Pacific War, they think, well, the Marines, as they should. But when you look at the numbers, like as you kind of did in World War II, it's like the Army was there a lot. And, you know, and we did a good job. We took all the credit. But yeah, but and you know, you look at D-Day, which we just celebrated, the massive, the most celebrated amphibious operation in U.S. history, right? But who made all that possible in the 1930s? Where? Yeah, here. I mean, literally here was where we figured out how to launch amphibious operations. So you guys are living that right now. The Marine Corps is doing that right now. And taking a bet, you know, that this vision of war will be the right one.
It's the backbone for the Normandy landings. It's the backbone for the Pacific campaign. All of that, right? And just to kind of hit on what Vic brought up about does the good guy always have to win in shaping narrative? Because I too believe narrative is great in getting these things out there and getting those visions. The good guy doesn't always have to win. I think your book 2034 is probably a big example. Without giving away any of it, the good guy doesn't win, but neither does the bad guy,
yeah.
Right? And so you have to read the book to figure that out. But Sergeant, what do you got?
I think that everybody here can agree that we should try our best to avoid World War III. What are some steps do you think that could be taken to mitigate that?
Understanding the rules of the game that you're in. So when you get caught into these cycles, escalatory cycle, and in 2034, that's actually what we try to imagine. It's like it has the feel sort of the guns of August, like the First World War. It's where just everyone's marching into this insane lockstep of sending the entire world into a world war. And I think today, you know, we need leaders who can, you know, similarly, you know, as we're going down the escalatory path and they see the off-ramp, they take the off-ramp. I would say that the other thing that we can do is to be ready. Weakness is a provocation, as much as strength is a provocation. So, you know, what history teaches me is that in certain situations, sort of the placating the adversary is actually an escalatory act, and that the way you de-escalate is through strength. But it's tough. You know, it's tough. You have, you know, our leaders have to know the difference. We need wise leaders, sound leadership to understand, you know, the time when projecting strength is the de-escalatory action, and the time when, you know, looking for avenues for reconciliation is de-escalatory. But we should all be concerned about it right now. I mean, we are living in a world that is a tinderbox.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Hey, good morning, sir. My name is Sergeant Doyle. I've been a squad leader for the better part of 4 years now. I'm an aspiring platoon commander, submitting my MESA package currently. Obviously, they're both leaders within an infantry platoon. The dynamic is still very different. I was just wondering, from your own perspective, what would you say is the best quality or something that I should strive to do if I do become a platoon commander? What's the one quality or thing that I should strive to accomplish? And then on the other side of the coin, what's something I should try to stay away from?
In a platoon, in a rifle platoon, there's only one of you, and you have a specific role. And I had seen platoon commanders sometimes make the mistake of, you know, sort of playing more a role of squad leader, or, you know, not kind of staying generally in their lane and understanding which buttons to push. Like, let me give you an example. So, like, let's say I'm walking across the battalion area, and, like, you know, Schmuckatelli is, you know, doing something stupid, and I kind of see him doing it out of the corner of my eye, and, like, so I can either, like, go over there and, like, you know, life him out and, you know, do all that business and brace him up at parade rest and, you know, and then go about my business. Like, I would never do that. Not in a million years. What I would do is I go walk around, and I'd either find like my squad leader, and I'd be like, hey, come on, man, what the hell? I didn't know you discuss, or, you know, they go and they go do it. And then after Schmuckatelli gets like lifed out and is crushed and has been shown the error of his ways, then you know there's so later my hey, so I met with Sergeant so-and-so, it's really hard. You know, it's like, we're good, you're all right, we love you. And then, you know, and he would never know the whole reason he got lifed out was because of me. And I don't say that to be deceptive, it's more like, you know, that's your job. And I felt this with people I worked for. There were times when I had bosses where, you know, we were doing things that were hard and that sucked and that I thought were crazy and I couldn't even understand sometimes. But if my boss was always like, he's sane and a good dude, I felt okay doing it. And it comes back to this idea of trust. So I think you need to know that being a squad leader is different than being a platoon commander. Being a team leader is different than being a squad leader. You know, if everyone kind of plays, the platoons that work the best is where everyone is playing their position. It's like, it's like a football team. You know, you don't want your wide receiver trying to be the quarterback and vice versa. So as a platoon commander, I would tell you, you know, understand your job as a platoon commander and do your damnedest. And it doesn't mean you can't ever, you know, Schmuckatelli's like about to, you know, spray the whole platoon with his saw, maybe go like, you know, smack him in the face. But try to avoid that and play your position.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
We'll go over this side and then we'll swap over.
How would you say that we prepare for those, not those international threats, but those domestic threats? And what are ways that, as a country, we can come and try to mitigate the risk of an internal civil war?
You know, we're living in I think, extremely challenging and politically fraught times. I think the one thing as service members that I think all of you can do is you are part of one of the last institutions that Americans trust, and I think that there's a direct correlation with that because the U.S. military seems a place that is generally apolitical. Doesn't mean everyone here doesn't have their political beliefs, but it means we leave it at the door in service of a larger mission, which is our country. And I think that is a very important example for the nation to have. And if we ever lose that, we are in a lot of trouble. So I would say, you know, what can we do? I think you guys are what we can do, which is to keep setting that example. But, you know, I wish I could sit up here and tell you in a 30-second answer exactly what we need to do to fix our country. I don't have that answer. But I would just tell it to you, and what I try to do is just sort of live the best that I can as a citizen, set a good example for my children, if you have them, because hopefully they're gonna kind of be part of the solution as well.
Morning, my name is Sergeant McGrorty, and I'm very interested in AI in the battle space, and I wanted to hear what your opinions were in AI in the battle space and the future of that and what that would look like.
The rate of change on the battlefield right now is occurring at speeds I have never seen. Just a cycle of innovation. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this idea of the OODA loop. You guys heard that? Okay, so you know the OODA loop, right? John Boyd, yeah. The OODA loop on the battlefield is extremely quick, and a lot of that is coming from AI. And so much as, you know, for instance, drones. Like drones showed up, you know, in a really meaningful way on the battlefield. And, well, you know, the war in Ukraine starts, and sort of the big news is, you know, the overperformance of, you know, javelins and in-laws against Russian armor. And then it kind of migrates into a much more artillery-centric war. And now you have an artillery-centric war combined with, you know, pretty amazing drone technology. When I was there last, I had actually, it was a Ukrainian Marine from the 36th Brigade was showing me video of how they clear trenches, and they clear trenches with drones. So they hop into the trench. They're going down the trench, and in front of them are, you know, 5 or 6 armed drones. They're going down the trench, and they hit it, rush, they blow up, and then next drone goes in. So you talk about AI. Well, you know, they're doing it now, you know, mostly manually, but it's very easy to imagine drone swarms that are powered by AI. You know, so the swarm goes out. You don't need someone controlling. The swarm just goes to target. So that, I think, is we're seeing is a huge impact of AI. And what is that? What does a U.S. carrier or a U.S. frigate do if it's confronted with 100 armed drones that it's got to try to swat out of the sky? And then AI is also factoring into targeting right now. I mean, you're seeing it in Israel. The way they're selecting targets is through AI analysis of satellite imagery. And sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't work. And then when you go even further into the future, you know, you get to these ideas of you know, weapons that are wholly powered by artificial intelligence, and then the morality of whether or not they are allowed to be lethal without a human decision maker behind them. And current U.S. policy is that all AI targeting, somewhere in the kill chain, there has to be a human being saying, all right, execute. But you can imagine that our adversaries might not have any qualms saying, no, no human in the kill chain, you know, because that will speed the cycle. So, you know, those are questions that we're hurtling towards. And, you know, you all, you know, might live it in your careers and have to figure out what the response is. So it's a dangerous and exciting time to be in uniform.
Yeah, and I'll absolutely say that that's one of the scenarios I brought up to my students as I taught them about medieval warfare and how fundamentally character of war is changing, right? Again, that same exact scenario where, you know, time now we have to worry about artificial intelligence being integrated with things like drones, where it can simply say, this is the targeting signature, this is what a JLTV looks like, this is what an aircraft carrier looks like. You don't need authorization from a human to target that, right? And again, like I said, U.S. policy right now, we don't allow that, but who's to say that that bad actors or adversaries would not go to that step? You know, we could probably imagine that they would, right? And a shameless plug, you know, there's some copies of this book. There's 4 volumes over there, and you're welcome to take any of them. They're free. It's called Destination Unknown, and in that book, it's a graphic novel style of future warfare, right? Very similar to 2034 and Ghost Fleet and these other books we've talked about. Same thing, but published by the Marine Corps, written by Marines, right? And in volume 4, the copy I gave you this morning, a drone swarm attacks adversary vessels in the same exact manner, right? So feel free to take those, and at the end of each one of those short chapters is questions that you can actually have discussions with your Marines about. So I'd encourage all you small, leaders to go ahead and take a copy, but I'll turn it forward to Sergeant Major.
But when you see the evolution of the institution to where we have a gunnery sergeant of Marines sitting up here with a former commissioned officer, now a best-selling author, leading a conversation, leading a discussion, enhancing the intellectual edge of warfighters, it's impressive. I wish I had conversations like this as I was coming up as a young sergeant of Marines. I wish I had leaders like you all that were interested in discussing books. I wish I had leaders who were asking conversations in a very articulate way without using the curse words and expressing themselves in a very articulate, comprehensive manner. I wish I had that when I was growing up. I would be a lot better than what I am today. And if I can get here without having those things that you're fortunate enough to have, what does that mean to you? You can be way better than me. You're way more set up for success to be a better leader of Marines. You're way more set up for success at being a better citizen, right? You're way better set up for success to be an example of what right looks like than what I have ever been in my career. It's impressive. Just because we're here on an academic university, on a Marine Corps University, doesn't mean that you, as sergeants and Marines, can't go back to your units and do the same exact thing. To dedicate time to work out the strongest weapon that you have is your mind. We spend a lot of time investing in the gym, going out and doing PFTs, CFTs. We should spend just as much time, if not more, working out our brain, having conversations with people, to seek to understand versus to be understood yourself. Again, I repeat for a reason, sitting here looking at you all, again, remembering the legacy of Sergeant Singleton, it's impressive as to where the institution is today. Mr. Ackerman, I thank you for your time. I thank you for making the opportunity to come out here and speak with us. This time, Gunnery Sergeant will present you with a gift.
Actually went and touched on World War I and what the Marines did in Belleau Wood and Oregon and places like that. Inscribed on the plaque itself, it says, "Mighty is a hand that can wield both the pen and the sword," and then there's a pen right below the bayonet as well. And the reason that I chose this is because there's a little bit of symbology that I think encapsulates, sir, what you've done in your career, both in and out of the Marine Corps, and that's because in World War I, of course, we look at World War I fundamentally in the Marine Corps for what it has done for our history, right? We look at the Marines and what they did at Belleau Wood, the Oregon, the term Tokelhunden, all these different things. We think about World War I as fundamental, right? But what we don't usually talk about is that World War I is important for another reason for the Marine Corps, and that's because the story of the Marines, which Mr. Ackerman alluded to, is really told in World War I. The writers that were out there on the battlefield capturing the bravery and the heroics of the Marines, they wrote about it and they put it on the front pages of newspapers and magazines back in America, to where the everyday citizen in America now knew the name of U.S. Marines. And it wasn't like that before, right? Before World War I starts, we're a force of 14,000 people, 14,000 Marines. post-World War I, we never let our foot off the gas when we took those reputations and we went forward, obviously, to a 500,000 person force in World War II, and we continue to do great things, but it's because people wrote about it, and it's because the bravery happened on the battlefield. So this hopefully encapsulates both of those things, because you have proven that you can wield the sword in your time in the Marine Corps, and you've proven that you are continuing to master the thing by telling the stories that intrigue the minds of the people in this room. So thank you.
Keep going.
Thank you.